This is Together, an Ada Bible Church podcast about the world of marriage, where we attempt to invite you to explore the ways marriage works and doesn't work. From practical ways of learning to biblical inspiration, we invite you to listen to other professionals and couples to help enrich your marriage. Here are your hosts, Samuel Jones and Dr. Kelly Bonniwell.
Listeners, we are excited again to have you back for Together. Today, we have an amazing guest. This is going to be one of those podcasts that we're going to ask you as a very mature couple to have kids, children, teens, maybe even leave the room. And or if you're traveling in the car, put some muffs on them, because this conversation is going to be one that's intricately made just for you as a married couple. We, in our goal of talking about things that are relational and relative to you, want to make sure that when we're staying positive and giving helpful advice, especially when we're talking about sex and intimacy, that those things are in a place that are conducive for that environment. And so I just want to encourage you as listeners to make sure that you are in a place that you can listen to this with your spouse, and that hopefully it'll help create a conversation and create a way for you to talk about this later on after you listen to this podcast. So Kelly, it's a great time to be alive.
Yeah, it is. And I'm so excited to have Sarah here.
Yeah.
So I've known Sarah for a while, and I supervised Sarah for a couple years. And so we really got to know one another, talking about cases she was involved in, and got to know her a little bit personally. And when we were thinking about doing a podcast on sex, which if you're going to talk about marriage, you got to talk about sex, Sarah was the first who came to my mind. And so, Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thanks for doing the podcast and shining a light on this issue of marriage. I think there's so many things that compete for our attention in this world. So it's a great reminder to take our relationship off of the back burner and do some reflecting and hopefully talking, about these different issues.
That's it. That's it. And so, Sarah, if we could just start, let's tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and, about your journey to getting to this space.
Yes. So, Sarah Eastway, as you said, I got my Master's of Science in Counseling and have been working with clients since 2009.
Okay.
I love what I do. I think it is a privilege that people invite you into the sacred space that is their life and their heart, and that I get to come alongside and journey with them through life, which is wonderful and really hard sometimes. So, I started out in county-funded public mental health, and then after having kids, wanted to work part-time, and I couldn't do that in that setting, so transitioned into more of the private practice agency setting. And after my youngest, I started my LLC here in Grand Rapids. So I did start out in Sacramento, California, but then moved to Grand Rapids, had my youngest, and then started my LLC Haven Alliance. And I office with Dr. Dan Ennis at Forest Hills Counseling Center. So that's where I'm at.
Awesome. So that's a little bit about your family and your practice. But what do you do for fun? Like, what is a counselor that does sex therapy type of stuff do for fun?
Good question. So I love to be outside. I love hiking. Yeah. I'm a game player. I love playing games and just quality time with friends and family and being involved in the community. I met my husband, Kevin, through Young Life. He works full-time for Young Life, which is a ministry for all types of kids, an outreach ministry. And so that's how we met. And we have our 2 boys, as well as a young man who we met as a middle schooler. And then he needed a place to live. So he ended up living with us at the end of high school and beginning of college. And so he's been a big part of our family since then. And so,
I never knew that.
Things.
When I saw that, Sarah, that's so cool. So how old is he now?
Isaiah's 30 now, and is married with one kid on the way. And so,
very cool.
Yes, it was hard during COVID to delay. We had a trip planned to meet the baby right away, and then that got delayed because of COVID. So eventually got out to Sacramento to meet little Zachary. So.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So what other, I know, today's topic is about, sex in the context of marriage. But what other kind of topics do you like to kind of navigate and work with in terms of your clients?
Yes, thanks. I work with people on a variety of issues, and I love that variety, whether it's identity things or transitions. Anxiety and depression are so common these days. So I love that variety. And over the years, I've found myself kind of falling into a couple niches, including couples counseling, and then women's issues, particularly surrounding sexual issues, sexual pain, overcoming sexual trauma, that type of thing.
Awesome.
Well, let's jump in and let's talk about this topic of sex, shall we? So, as both of you know, you've got the top 3 issues in marriage: communication or conflict resolution, money or finances, and then the third is sex. And out of all 3 of those, I think one of the challenges is that third one, sex, is maybe the most difficult to talk about if you're a couple and you're struggling in that area. And so on that note, we really hope that you can take a lot of the information and that we're going to share today and kind of integrate that into your relationship. And if you are struggling in that area and you haven't had the courage to really talk to your spouse about this, maybe now might be the time. So with that, one of the cool things that I think about, because like Samuel and Sarah, I've done a lot of work with couples on sexuality. And one of the starting places that I go with them is that God is very, very pro-sexual, even to the point, he made us sexual beings, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But even beyond that, he dedicated an entire book to sexuality, and it's the Song of Songs. It's in the Old Testament. It was written by Solomon. And one of the interesting things about that book is it's basically erotica. Okay? That's what it is. So a little clue here. In the book, there's a lot of talk about navels and apples and lilies. Let me just tell you, you're going to have to do your own research. Navels aren't navels in the Song of Songs. Okay? And apples aren't apples. And lilies might not be lilies. So maybe you go find a good book on Jewish literature or something like that.
Shocking.
and do a deeper dive. But I think it is so beautiful that God in the Bible has a book of erotica, which gives us kind of a roadmap to what maybe a sexual relationship can look like. So I've got a question for you, you and Samuel, Sarah. As a creation, so God made us, and he made us emotional. He made us physical. We have a body. He made us spiritual. We have a soul. And he also made us mental, meaning he gave us an intellect and a mind. But he also created us as sexual people too.
Yeah.
Like, talk to me a little bit about that. Like, maybe why or what are the positives there? Like,
Yeah. I mean, let's go Bible here. Number 1, the 2 become one. He says, have dominion. He says, populate the earth. Populate the earth means procreation.
Right.
And I think
Need sex for that.
Right. You gotta have sex for some procreation. I think in that, he also calls it good. He says, man, I made you and I made you good. If he takes pleasure in us, then that means we should also take pleasure in one another. And that's that sexual aspect. And so when we begin to do those things, it begins to allow us to actually glorify God in that moment. So you can imagine that if sex is also very, emotional and spiritual and mental and physical, it's going to cover all those kind of places. And the Bible actually guides us and talks to us about those things: procreation, sexual pleasure. But also there's this space where we do have some level of a physiological response, and in that, we'll talk about science. We'll do the science of sex, right?
Okay, let's do science first.
Sarah, I'm sure you're gonna just get into it and tell us a lot more. But like oxytocin, there's an oxytocin release that causes a sense of trust and makes us miss our partners. Like, for example, my wife is not here, but you can bet by golly gee that I miss my wife right now. And when we get together, it's a great time. And so, I think it's also a natural painkiller. We sometimes see sex done in the context of you just got done with a crazy fight, but then all of a sudden, that sexual opportunity, whatever, may have caused you to come and be like, man, I start to relieve the pain in regards to the emotional piece of something that may have happened. I know you'll talk about that later in the right and proper context. But it triggers the release of endorphins, which reduces pain and stress. Also, oxytocin release causes a sense of trust and makes us, in a sense of boosting our immune system, and I can imagine if it's, again, done in the right and proper context, I feel really good.
Yeah, it's interesting
happens, right?
that God, designed us to have those hormones. And so I think that speaks to the possibility that sex can be for pleasure as well and not just procreation. The fact that our bodies do give that oxytocin release, and it can be something that brings us together.
Yeah, I wonder, like, Sarah, like in this space of when we're trying to make love or when we do make love to our spouse, what does that do in regards to, I guess, creating some type of opportunity? What does that do?
I think that it is an opportunity to say, in the midst of everything else going on in our lives, here is the one thing that we share, just the two of us. And so it can be that place to connect. I think it is also a time to be serving. I think that I've seen, and maybe you have too, that oftentimes you have one person in the marriage who says, well, I'm not interested in having sex unless I'm already feeling like we're emotionally connected. And then you might have the spouse who's thinking, well, man, the way I feel most emotionally close is when we have sex. So I would like to have physical intimacy so that I can feel greater emotional intimacy. And why those opposing views? Why would God give us those opposing views? And because it can cause misunderstanding and conflict and all those things. But I think it gives us an opportunity to serve our partner, to say, yep, there's times when I want my wants met and I want it kind of with my conditions after we've emotionally met. But there's also times when I can say, okay, I'm going to set myself aside and do what I know my partner would like in this situation.
That's so good.
It is so good, Sarah. So let's talk about what creates a healthy sexual relationship. I think there are some key ingredients, and I'll give you one. One of the things that when I'm working with couples who have reached out to me and want to work in this area, one of the first things that I talk to them about is, on some level, you have to get on the same page in terms of how often you want to be sexual. We're going to talk about this later, but we're going to talk about high libido versus low libido person in a marriage. But often, like number one, a lot of times couples don't even talk about that. But number two, often when they do talk about it, they're on very different pages. And so it's important to get on the same page. Samuel, do you have one or two that you think are important ingredients to a healthy sexual relationship?
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, this is a adult topic. And so we're talking about not only, your quantity, but we're also talking about how creative can you be, in the midst of sex. It's not just your type. It's not just your style, but how we collectively agree to get there to that point where we both are having pleasure. And I think that is a conversation that we encourage every couple to have. Mm-hmm. What is appropriate in the bedroom? What does that look like? And having that conversation, you got to be able to do that. I have it all the time with my couples. We're in the middle of counseling and everything's going good but sex. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
And you have, what you'll talk about, Sarah, is you have all your back history, you have all those things. Maybe if you had partners before or if you had no partners at all, all the things you're trying to navigate in terms of, well, how do we do this? Well, it's a conversation. And the conversation is not just about how often and how much, it's sometimes about when, where, and why, and I think that those things are important.
That communication, I think, is so key. And I think it's interesting because our world throws sex at our faces in so many ways, especially looking at the media. And then at the same time, we struggle so often to have an actual conversation about our own sexual lives with our partners or within the church. I think that there's so many messages being sent to us, but then there's still taboo topics to talk about within the church. And we need to open up those lines of communication so we can figure this out. I think we say, okay, couples, don't have sex. Now you're married and it'll just be easy. Go figure it out. Have fun. And we need to communicate about it because there are all sorts of things that come up with it and different challenges or different expectations. So that being able to communicate about it is really key.
Yeah. And Sarah, I remember when we got a chance and I met you for the first time, you talked about the importance of safety too, in regards to like, how do you navigate safety as a part of that healthy sexuality as well?
Absolutely. So, for the purpose of this podcast and discussion, when we're talking about having conversations about sex and working on different parts of sex lives, that is assuming that you are consensual adults who are choosing to have sex. And so even in a marriage, no one should feel forced to have sex or to do something they're not comfortable with. So we wanted to just kind of throw out that safety caveat. And also, if a person has a history of sexual trauma, if they're dealing with pain, a history of abuse, then it's likely that they might need to get some support in processing those things, and might have trouble, with sex being as enjoyable as it can be, until they do some of that processing and get some of that support. So if you are somebody out there who is listening and part of your challenge with sex is that there is some sort of safety or trauma issue, you're going to have to deal with that first to then be able to get to the good stuff. Let's get better at sex as a couple.
So important.
So important, Sarah. And again, the other thing I really like what you brought out is for some, they maybe have sexual trauma in their past or abuse or other dynamics. And if you haven't really dealt with those things, it maybe is a barrier to you to having a healthy sexual experience.
Correct.
And therefore, one of the things that we're going to just over and over in this episode talk about is if you're struggling in this area, please get professional help. Reach out to us. We have a lot of great counselors. Sarah would be one of them who work in this area and want to help you grow, heal, et cetera, et cetera. So to switch gears a little bit, one of the things that I have found in my practice with working with couples is that there's some myths or just things that they believe about sex or their bodies that just isn't true. And so you have to work on that first. What are some of those things, Sarah, that you've seen in your practice where, you have to rework what they think about just about sex in general.
Mm-hmm. I think that for some, especially Christian couples, that, you've been told, don't have sex. And so sex can almost have this negative pressure built around it.
So true.
And then now we're married, and the next day I am just supposed to flip a switch that says, yes, sex, and go for it. And so just even how we talk about sex as the church, but also just knowing that it takes time to process that, and that sex is not bad and it is God-given. And it takes time to figure out. So I think another, myth out there is watching all of the shows and movies we see with the music and the lights and candles. And it's just always so smooth going and everybody ends up happy. And, having to learn that sex takes a little more figuring out than that.
Absolutely.
So that's a myth, I think, out there.
That's a good one.
That's a really good one. I remember just a story about that, a PG story. I remember I was working with a couple, and again, they came up in an environment where, again, the church talked about sex from a position of it's not good.
Mm-hmm.
It's not good for you. It's not good for anyone from the frame of you being single.
Mm-hmm.
But then you come into they came into this context of, okay, we're getting married, we're gonna, talk about finances. We're going to talk about communication. We're going to do all the SIMBIS related things.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in that moment after they got married, one of the biggest things that they came back and talked to me about in counseling was about our sexual relationship is not good.
Mm-hmm.
But we had to talk about what was their psychology, what was their upbringing, what was their familial context, and the church context, which drove a lot of that, ended up being the thing. Well, we were taught that this wasn't the thing that, and so now you have one person who has a high libido, which we're getting to, and another person's like, I'm not sure that this is the right thing that we should do. And they struggled with that for quite a bit of time. Mm-hmm. And so being able to have a great conversation about those things and about, it is good, it is godly, it is pleasurable, and that it sometimes takes time to get to there, and that your partner has to allow you to have that time is really important in that, as you were just mentioning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think another myth out there, or just idea that I see come up in my work with clients that I try to shift, is that the idea that sex is only successful or good if one or both people have an orgasm. And so helping couples redefine, okay, what does making love include? And that's everything from, holding hands and the foot rub all the way to orgasm and everything in between. And so if we're prioritizing having this time of physical intimacy together, that's the success, no matter what the outcome is of that. And so, not getting discouraged or upset if you don't have a certain outcome you were hoping for, but being able to say, hey, this was good. This was good because we're working on us and we are spending this time together. And so trying to just expand that definition of what's involved in making love and take the pressure off of the expectations of, well, what has to happen in order for it to be good?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so just based off you say that, I have a question. So we hear this old adage, and wonder if this is myth or truth. They say women are crockpots and men are like microwaves, right? Is that true? Is that a myth?
I think that there is a stereotype there, and stereotypes are often there for a reason, because in a lot of cases it's true. So I think in a lot of cases you might have it where the man is more interested in sex and ready to go right away, and the woman is less interested, or it takes her longer to get in the mood. But that's definitely not always the case. And I'm glad that we're pointing that out, because for those couples where that's not the case, when everybody always assumes that that is how it is, then you start thinking, well, what's wrong with me? So if it's the wife who wants to have sex more often, she's thinking, well, what's wrong with me? Because all of the other husbands, always want sex more than the wives. So why not me? And, vice versa for the husband. So I think it's a stereotype for a reason, but we never want to assume things are, true across the board.
Don't assume. So good. So good, Kelly.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to talking about the high libido versus the low libido couple. And one of the things that I found, especially in the church, is that a lot of couples, for our listeners, you've heard Samuel and I talk about this dynamic before. You have to have 3 loves in your marriage. You have to have commitment. You have to have friendship. That means I like my spouse. Commitment is capital L, I love my spouse. And then you have to have sexual love, or eros in the Greek. And you have to have all 3. And the challenging thing with the couples that I've worked with who come out and reach out for help is they have great commitment. They have great friendship, but they're really struggling with eros. And one of the dynamics that I have found consistently, and if you're going to do sex therapy, this is kind of like bread and butter stuff. A lot of couples are, you'll have one person who is high libido, and then you'll have another person who is low libido. High libido would be, I want sex a lot, like a lot. The other person is, I could take it or leave it. And I'm very much less interested in it. And then even to the point, remember earlier we talked about quantity. This is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of quantity. The high libido person would say, I want sex twice a day. And I've heard that before. I've heard 3 times a day. And I'm like, okay, I don't know how realistic that is.
Right.
But the other person is like, once a quarter. Well, if you've got somebody who is, we'll just say once a day, and versus once a quarter, there are going to be challenges.
Right. There's a conflict there.
So Samuel, Sarah, talk a little bit more about your experiences in working with couples who are high versus low libido.
Yeah.
I think that, you mentioned quantity, and I think what's interesting is that is very couple specific. So I think that it varies a lot. And so I don't know if I have people ask me, is there like a magic number that we should be shooting for? And in my experience with couples, it really varies. So I have had couples who, if they're communicating about it and they're both being honest and they're both seem to be satisfied with twice a month, then good for them. And that's great. And that should be their quantity. You might have another couple who's like, well, twice a week isn't even close to enough. And so it really is couple specific. And
so
then
true.
As you're saying, even within the couple, that individual difference, I think sometimes too, for the person who has a lower libido, it is that idea of, well, maybe we need to have the emotional connection first. I think there's also seasons of life where you do think it's important and you see the value and you have good intentions. But when your spouse initiates it, you're, oh, no, but with the intention of, I know it's important. And so, maybe tomorrow will be a better time. But unfortunately, you're tired, life is busy, and so it just keeps getting pushed further and further out. And so then you might be the partner that seems to have a lower libido, but really you have the intention and the desire of knowing that sex is an important part, but it's trying to figure out, okay, how do we prioritize time in our marriage so that we're not too exhausted to have sex, so that we're not too emotionally distant to want to have sex.
Yeah, that's so good. I could think too, and you mentioned it, Sarah and Kelly, this aspect of when seasons change and seasons shift. For example, and I'm a man, so I can't get pregnant, but my wife, she can get pregnant. And if someone is pregnant, they're going to have a conversation about, okay, now how often are we having sex?
Things change, right?
What does that mean? Right? We got kids running around the house, and somebody's tired. How often are we getting ready to have sex? Right? And I think that those things that you brought out and mentioned in that, so many couples sometimes, especially if they're in their younger married years, where they're, and especially, I'll say this caveat too, when their relationship is based off of sex, or sex has been made a god in their lives, I got together because sex was amazing with this person. Okay. Well, what happens when things change? Now, all of a sudden, we have an issue and problem based off of this thing that we made a god as a part of our marriage. Maybe our marriage is based off sex. And in that moment, those couples that I've talked to that has happened, it's been a thing of, okay, how do we now change and shift our thought processes and have communication about what this actually looks like, especially because one person has this high libido and another person now, because of changes in seasons, has a low one. And so I think that those are key pieces as well.
Well, and again, the communication piece of sex can be a hard topic to talk about because there's lots of emotions involved in it. There's fears that, fears of inadequacy or fears of rejection. And so you do have to be delicate when you're talking about it. And, I think another tip to throw in there is try to talk about it not just in the moment. Like, sometimes I think the only times people are talking about sex is after one person has tried to initiate and then they feel rejected and now we're all emotional and that's when we're talking about it. So let's try to have conversations about it, just on your regular day in the afternoon or whatever, right? Like whenever you can, just have a less heated conversation about it and then come to the table and say, okay, we want the same thing here. We're on the same side. We want to both figure out how to make sex a healthy part of our marriage, and then communicate, how do we do that? And so, you mentioned something when you said the kids running around and the season of life with little kids. So back to your creativity piece, I've seen a lot of couples get in a rut because they only consider sex when they're going to bed. That is usually in the past, always when it happened. And so that's just what they think. Well, the reality is when you're in those little kid and baby years and toddler years, I don't know a mom who doesn't reach the end of the day and she's just exhausted and crashing into bed and thinking, all I want to do is just lay here and be my own person. And if that's the case, okay, well, then you can have sex other times of the day. So we got to get creative and figure out, is there a time when, could it be early in the morning? Could it be throwing on Netflix and the kids are watching something and you're going to the bedroom? Because we got to troubleshoot together. So being able to sit down and have those conversations and figure it out and troubleshoot. And I think, back to bringing up the science piece, I think when we're talking about high libido and low libido, the reality is that there are biological factors at place there. And that can change over time with testosterone levels and estrogen levels. And I think, the female orgasm is sometimes referred to as being really elusive. And so, you got to be patient in trying to figure it out. And that doesn't mean that if you're struggling to have an orgasm, that doesn't mean that you have a low libido necessarily. It might just mean that you need to do more things to try to figure it out. But all of that takes the couple being willing to talk about things and say, hey, what do you think about this? How do you feel about that? Are you willing to try this?
Yeah, Sarah, that's so good. And that kind of takes us to just a brief topic I want to talk about. And that is, if you are struggling, you've got to read books. And and you've got to educate yourself, and you've got to, for example, when you were talking about the woman or the male who's having trouble with orgasm, there's a lot of great books out there, and I want to make a couple comments on that. The first one is, I've read a lot of books on sex, and one of the things I've found is that there are some good Christian books. I've never come across a great Christian book. And so I am often reading, for a better word, secular books. But with that, when you're reading a secular book, you have to read critically. And you also have to realize you don't have to agree with everything that they say.
You can pull out some golden nuggets without agreeing with the whole thing.
But they might be talking about some strategies or some techniques or some ideas that you're just not going to find in a Christian book. There aren't a lot of Christian books out there in the first place. And so one way that I put it is, in a certain sense, Christian books don't go too far, and maybe a secular book goes too far. The Christian book doesn't go far enough. The secular book goes too far. And, but just read critically. Don't be scared. If you go to a Barnes and Noble and you go to that section, where they have the books on sexuality, be adventurous and buy a book or two and, read it critically. And I think that you will, get some really good stuff out of that. On that note, Sarah, and I want you to start here. What are some starting points to connect better sexually for couples? Like, what are some of the ideas that you've come up when working with clients? And then eventually here we're gonna talk about a client or two that you worked with and how you walked them through their struggle.
I think that another thing that I want to throw out there is with female sexual pain that when you bring up a starting point, the starting point might need to be getting rid of or trying to decrease the pain that is present. And
talk a lot about that with us, Sarah.
Well, and I think, there are a lot of things out there that give specific tips where the Christian books don't go far enough. But different positions can help with pain. Using more lubricant can help with pain. Going to your doctor and making sure there's not a physiological problem that is attributed to it. And so trying to figure out how to get to the bottom of where that pain might be coming. It might be insecurities and stress and pressure are causing the woman to just be physically tense, which is then causing pain. And so being able to say, okay, in order to enjoy this experience together, I got to be more relaxed. Let's enjoy this. Let's not feel pressure about it. Let's do whatever strategies we need to do to decrease pain. Because man, that can cause a lot of conflict in a relationship when somebody wants to have sex more and more, but if you're in pain and it doesn't seem like your partner cares about that pain, then it's going to be hard to want to have sex. So figuring out what are some of the barriers there can be a good place to start. So you're saying other starting points to connect.
Well, another kind of myth or something I've talked about, in particular with male clients, is, and this kind of gets back to the microwave versus crockpot thing. One of the things I found, just even also in my own life, women just are much more dynamic creations in a certain sense. So as one example, orgasm usually for men is not a huge issue unless you're having like premature ejaculation or erectile dysfunction. But a big thing for women can be orgasm issues or the lack of. But at the same time, women can have multiple orgasms, right? So they're a much more dynamic creation.
Oh, the complexity's there. Yes.
Yeah, the
and the potential for the pleasure and the enjoyment and it being a good thing is high.
Exactly. And I think that for some men, again, this goes back to educating yourself, of understanding your spouse at a biological level. Your spouse is different from you. They're made differently. And to be more compassionate, like when you were talking about female sexual pain, I definitely have met with men like, oh, it's all psychological, or she's making it up, and to get them to a place of, no, she's most likely not making it up. It's real. And therefore you're going to have to adjust as a couple moving forward to, and again, to educate yourself. So why don't we spend some time talking about a client or two? Because when you talked about these two clients when we had coffee together, I thought they were like two really excellent stories that maybe some of our listeners can really relate to. And so why don't you share?
Yeah, well, I think the first example, I think, covers a lot of things that we've already touched upon, but it is a common story. And so I was working with a couple, and they were a Christian couple, got married young and had waited to have sex. And then you're married and sex didn't go well at first due to physical pain and a lacking of knowing what things can we try. And so it quickly, within the first few months of marriage, became a difficult and hurtful topic. It was just this huge disappointment of, hey, we waited. I thought this was going to be the best thing ever. Now we're running into some roadblocks and we're just defeated. And it's emotional, and we're fighting anytime we talk about it. And so
I hear this story all the time.
Yes,
Sarah,
yes. The woman in this case, the wife who was having pain, she felt inadequate, and like her husband would never think she was doing enough in the sexual arena of things, and that she would never be good enough. And she was angry that her husband didn't seem to understand that her pain was an issue. And how can he just expect me to have this pain, but do it anyways? And so she's upset, and he's feeling rejected and hurt because the wife doesn't seem to want to be close with him in that way. And so now he's not even really wanting to talk about it, or he even stops initiating it as much because he's just afraid it's going to end in a rejection again.
And this is the cool part that I want you to talk about. And that is, they reach out to you and they begin to solve these issues with your help. How did that happen?
Well, even in therapy, the first few times that sex came up, as we were talking about other issues, you could just see the tension, and it was just high conflict. Defenses were up, and so we couldn't even get there right away. But after several sessions, and we're working on other things, and they're feeling better about the therapeutic process, it was really just helping them understand. You're on the same team.
So good.
It had been so hurtful that anytime they thought about sex or talked about sex, it had become a me versus them, the other person, because we just so don't understand each other and we want different things. And so to be able to say, hey, you're on the same team here. Let's try to come to the table and talk about this and brainstorm. I mean, remembering that we want the same thing. We want to be able to have enjoyable sex. And then being able to just say, oh, when I look across the room and we're having this conversation, you're my teammate. You're not my opponent.
So good.
Just finally allowed them to have the conversations that they were trying to have, but the defenses weren't going up as quickly, and fears weren't flying in their faces as much. And so we were able to just have these conversations of, okay, what do we want sex to look like? And what do we need to try? And just opening up those paths of communication that had been just blocked because of the frustration and the pain and hurt.
I love that story that you shared, because I think there's a lot of couples out there in that, sitting in that space,
Mm-hmm.
and where it's at an impasse. Whenever the topic comes up, it gets emotional, it gets angry, and I cannot pound the table hard enough to say, to our listeners, if you're in that space, I would say this, oftentimes the only way out of that is getting an unbiased third party who's professional, who does this to help you navigate these intense, strong arguments. And you could say this for any argument that's intense. It doesn't just have to be about sex, but this is the power of being a counselor and the positive that they bring into your life.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that, when they're trying to have the conversations, they're walking away, and the biggest feeling they're walking away with is, they just don't understand me. Like that other person doesn't get how I feel. And so being able to say, okay, so help each other understand how you feel. Is there a way we can talk about this? Oftentimes it might need to have the help of a third person or a counselor. Is there a way we can talk about this differently so that instead of walking away with, they don't understand, or I don't get them, it's, okay, let's help each other understand where we're at so that we're on the same team. Tackling this issue. Mm-hmm.
I love it. Yeah. Sarah, I wonder if in those spaces, especially on the male side, and this is not for all males, this is not all males that would say this, but for the male side, sometimes we may come in with certain expectations based off of reality TV, based off of our manhood, based off of what our uncles and dads have told us. And then that sometimes creates those spaces where, I can imagine so many stories of guys I've talked to where it becomes like a thing where sex is about conquering something. Sex is about conquering something. Sex is about sometimes, I have these expectations that should be fulfilled in the marriage bedroom. And this is not a harp on guys. It's just sometimes that's how we're taught and how we're trained.
The messages.
And so when we get into that space, and I love how you say it, we have to literally communicate about those spaces, because otherwise you deal with unfulfilled desires, which turn into other things, and we go into our imagination instead of going back to reality to have those conversations. So I love what you're saying. I love what you're saying. And so I guess that kind of turns to, do you have any other stories that you want to just kind of just share?
Well, I want you, Sarah, to talk about that other one about the a little bit older couple.
Yeah.
That was a really neat story.
Well, and I think just it's illustrating the power of being able to talk about things in the open. So the situation, it was a woman in her 50s, and she had a history of sexual abuse when she was a teen. And she had counseling before where she had processed that abuse, and that had helped. It had helped removing some of her triggers and anxiety. And I asked her if currently in their marriage, if she is able to enjoy sex, and she hesitated. She didn't answer. And then I said, well, are you able to have an orgasm? And she very quietly said, not with my husband. And I, asked, well, is there anyone else? And, oh, no, there's never been anyone else. And I said, well, what about through masturbation? And it was so dramatic just to watch her immediately break down and cry. And so I'm thinking, oh, wow, what have we just hit upon here? And she said, thank you so much for saying that word. I have struggled with this in secret for so long, and I've never been able to say that word. And no other therapist I've worked with or anywhere in church or what, no one else has said that word. And so I haven't been able to talk about it. So just by me being willing to talk about sex using words, that can explain that we have different experiences. And so what I was able to do was I was able to normalize for her that a part of abuse can be that you have a sexual awakening. And so even though her abuse was traumatic and horrible, and, she had done that work before surrounding that part of it, her physiological body had responded to it. And so what had happened is she had started masturbating as a teen without even realizing what she was doing. And she had never talked about it with anyone. It was this huge secret and burden and shame. And I think that even things different than sex, I think that no matter what that secret or shame is, when we're wrestling with it alone, it just has so much power over us. I think Satan can just get in there and keep us from being able to bring it out in the open and talk about it because there's so much shame. But by being able to do that, by saying that word, we were able to bring it out into the light. She was finally able to tell her husband. She had never told her husband or anybody. This was just such a secret, shameful thing. And her husband was accepting and supportive of it. And they were able to figure out, okay, so what can we do now? And so just being willing to have the difficult conversations, the open conversations so that we can deal with our past and find some healing from our past and not have the secrecy and shame.
So good.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really powerful story. And again, it gets back to that secrecy and shame that so often resides for some people. Because as we've talked about today, sex is really hard. Sex is really hard to talk about. I work with couples in sex therapy, and sometimes it's still difficult for me to talk about, it's just a very challenging, it's a very intimate topic. Duh. And so I think I just hope that if you're struggling in this area, and that you'd reach out and get help. So let's wrap this up, and let's just summarize and go around the room and just talk about what would be a couple of takeaways that you think you really want a listener to walk away from, and maybe it's even something we haven't talked about. Maybe it's something that you thought up while we've been talking together. Because this has been such a rich conversation. What are your thoughts, Samuel? What would you?
I definitely think, and this is just maybe even due to my work with couples who are in their premarital season, you definitely should have a conversation about it. Have a conversation, especially contextually if it has to do with your past. Your spouse should be on the understanding of what has happened. And what's going on, definitely if it's something that's been put out there. During that premarital season also, you might want to talk about what has been taboo, what has been those topics in regards to sex that you've been, as we talked about, Sarah, what is the messaging that's been around? What have you been taught? What has your parents taught you? What has society taught you? What have you come to believe? Right. And in those moments, you'll get a chance to have a really good education, as Kelly mentioned, about how they may be believing myths or truths in that moment. And then also I think that you have to be very conscious as a premarital couple in that season of what are you going to model your relationship after. And what I mean by that is in many cases, when we talked about books, you don't want to take every single thing from the book. You're like, well, I saw this movie and this is what sex looks like. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden you get across the marital line, or you get started in your marriage relationship. And all of a sudden you're in this moment where you're thinking about, well, sex is not like the movie, right? As we've been talking about. And so I think really understanding from a perspective of Song of Solomon, some really good books, those nuggets that we've all been talking about today, what do we want our sexual relationship to look like once we get married? I think it's a great conversation that you have to have, in that place of being in that premarital phase, and starting that. So that's definitely one for me. Yeah.
And then I think after you're married, realizing that, okay, now the real work has begun. And so we need to talk about it. And, we've talked a lot about talking about it with one another. Kelly, you mentioned counseling. You mentioned reading. I think being able to talk about it with a couple trusted friends, or if you have a mentor or a mentor couple that you're working with, can we talk about this in a respectful but open way in the church more? Not for the purposes of gossiping, or, it is a private thing. So sometimes we think that means we can't talk about it. But when it comes to understanding different things to try if you're having issues, or, hey, my friend went to this doctor, or, hey, this is what we tried when that happened. Can we have more of those conversations in a safe, trusted context so that we can just expand our knowledge and base on what it is we can do to work through sexual differences or sexual obstacles. So opening up the communication within the couple, but also let's talk about this within the church. Let's talk about this with some trusted friends. Let's read some books.
And as a starting point, my final word on it would be, if you are one of those couples who's struggling, you're not satisfied, or you just know something's off in your sexual relationship with your spouse, to somehow find that courage to just have the conversation. And a couple ideas there would be, maybe you might want to write it down first. Like, write down what you want to say. And you might even need to read that to your spouse. The second thing would be very purposeful about it. Schedule it. As Sarah, you mentioned, do not have this conversation when you're really emotional about it. Have it when everything is dialed down. And just, go to your spouse and say, hey, can we have an hour on Saturday afternoon? I just want to talk to you about some things. And then finally, which was kind of alluded to, for some people, you might be really angry about this in your life and dissatisfied. Go back to what Sarah said. Remember at the end of the day, you're on the same team with your spouse. And to have that mindset before you go in and have this difficult conversation, I think is really important.
Yeah, one word I like to encourage couples to use is when you're talking about it, especially initially, is connecting. So sometimes we can go into these conversations saying, why don't you ever want to have sex with me? Or, but instead saying, I would like us to feel more connected with one another.
So good.
I wish we were more connected, and that means emotionally and physically. What do you think we can do to get to the place where we're feeling more connected? Like, let that be a way to start the conversation versus
very good.
With anger.
Yeah.
Or accusations.
That is amazing. That's great. And I think that is, before our listeners get off the air, I think that is the key question that they should probably go home and ask today. And Sarah, number one, I want to say thank you.
Yeah, very much. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for being on together. You have brought such a needed, refreshing element. This probably is going to be the best podcast, the top list podcast in the year of 2021.
Well, it's like we've been saying, it's a hard topic that we need to talk about. Yeah. And we just barely scratched the surface as far as staying kind of broad. And I mean, there could be many more podcasts that went into more specific topics. But
That's
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this. And just to kind of make sure you have a couple points to walk away with, we want to make sure you know that sex is very much a part of God's original plan between a husband and a wife. We know it's meant for both enjoyment and also, guess what? It gives glory to God. Another key point that we've kind of can walk away with from this is that it should be preceded by a honest and transparent, emotional, mental, and physical conversation that allows people to experience the fullness of it. And lastly, just like Kelly said, sex is educational. It's something that both people have to learn to truly appreciate each other. If you have enjoyed this podcast, again, share, subscribe, like it, tell your friends who may not even go to church, and let them know that Together's on the air to give you really great content just like this podcast. We'll see you later.
Thanks for listening to Together. We hope that you've learned a thing or two. If you find the podcast helpful, please go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever your listening platform is and give us a 5-star rating. If you'd like more information on Ada Bible Church and its ministries, or someone to pray or dialogue with about your marriage, go online and check out our website at adabible.org.